Denmark is moving to ban the burning of holy books. That follows protests over the desecration of the Quran. But is this enough to appease anger in the Muslim world? And how can it be balanced with the freedom of expression? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. It's a controversial bill that could deepen political divisions in Denmark. The proposal to ban the desecration of holy books is being considered after a series of burnings of the Quran. The government has condemned the incidents and the small groups behind them, but despite the criticism, they're protected under Denmark's freedom of speech laws. Critics say the government is giving up on its liberal values too quickly. So, will the bill have enough support in Parliament to move forward? And will it strike the right balance at home and in Muslim countries? We'll get to this and more with our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Katia Lopez Hodayan.
It's a bill about politics and religion. Denmark's government is considering a measure that would make it illegal to burn copies of the Quran, with fines and up to 2 years in jail. It's an attempt to de-escalate tensions with Muslim countries after small groups recently desecrated the Muslim holy book.
Freedom of expression is a cornerstone of democracy in Denmark. That's why the government is aiming for limited and precise legal intervention. The bill will make it punishable to publicly burn the Quran, the Bible or the Torah.
The bill is already being criticized, with some saying the government is giving up on its liberal values, most notably freedom of speech.
In the Danish People's Party, we are firmly against limiting the freedom of expression. It's a cornerstone in any vibrant modern democracy.
Threats against national security are reported to have increased in Denmark following a series of recent Quran burnings. The bill is not just about optics, says the government, but about security at home and abroad. From Yemen to Iraq and the Netherlands, many protesters have called on European governments to take a tougher stance on such actions. More than diplomacy is at risk. The outrage could also damage economic ties between Denmark and Muslim nations, especially wealthy ones in the Gulf.
The Quran is our honor, our moral compass and our constitution, so we will defend it until our death. Yes to the Quran.
Neighboring Sweden is also considering ways to limit the burning of holy books after similar incidents. Along with other European governments, it will be monitoring Denmark's vote and the reaction it provokes within and beyond its borders. Katia Lopez Hodayan for Inside Story.
All right, for more on all this, I'm joined by our guests. In Washington, D.C. is Khaled Beydoun, professor of law at Arizona State University. Khaled is author of The New Crusades, Islamophobia and the Global War on Muslims. In Copenhagen is Per Bech Thomsen, former Denmark bureau chief for Reuters and author of a book on the Prophet Mohammed cartoon crisis. And in Williamstown, Massachusetts is Farid Hafiz, distinguished visiting professor at Williams College. Farid is also co-editor of the annual European Islamophobia report. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Per, let me start with you today. So Denmark's government says that it will move to criminalize the public mistreatment of religious objects. Where does public opinion in Denmark stand on all this right now?
I think it's fair to say they have good support. The most recent poll I saw that it showed that more than 50% actually supported this new legislation. So I think there's support, and also people. I mean, there's a huge majority also saying that burning the Quran is simply too stupid and not something we are in favor of. So I think there's support on this one.
Khaled, Denmark has struggled to stop these burnings of the Quran, but they are permitted under current freedom of expression laws. So how could a law like this actually be balanced with the freedom of expression?
Well, look, I think unfettered freedom of expression in Denmark has not only enabled but intensified Islamophobia at large, but also these Quran burnings. We see how Rasmus Paludan has really capitalized on the unrestrained freedom of expression context within Denmark. So a policy like this, which is really unprecedented in Western Europe, I think, checks. It puts a real formal check. It deters the kind of really, deviant expressions of Islamophobia, specifically these Quran burnings, from taking place and inciting more violence against a really vulnerable Muslim population within the country, specifically in large cities where Muslims tend to reside in Denmark.
Farid, let me ask you a different version of the question that I just posed to Khaled. Officials in Denmark are saying that this must all be done within the framework of constitutionally protected freedom of expression. From your perspective, is that something that can actually be done?
I think it's a difficult task, to be honest, because on the one hand, yes, this is clearly an infringement on freedom of speech on the one hand, especially given that Denmark has just get rid of its blasphemy laws, something that you find still in a couple of European countries, though it's not the most widespread system of regulation. But at the other side, I think what is really important to consider here is really like the context in which that happens. Obviously, the history of book burnings is, there is a long history of book burnings in Europe, right? And there is, on the one hand, this book burning of, the burning of the books of the powerful. So it's often seen as a sign of bravery. But on the other hand, there is, and this is really what speaks to this very specific context of the Danish or at large, the European Muslim communities. The Quran burnings is more of a symbol of like a symbolic humiliation of people who are already victims of structural racism. So the question really here is like, what is the Quran burning standing for? And I believe the way we are experiencing it in these days is more of, the humiliation of the already downtrodden, of people who are suffering various kinds of legal restrictions and of discrimination, even from the institutional sides.
Per, I saw you nodding along to some of what Farid was saying there. It looked like you might have wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that it is important to note that I think it's widely among most people here see that this is a very small group of far-right nationalists. I mean, some would even say it's lunatics doing this. And most people in Denmark also see this as purely a more or less an immature provocation. So we have to look at it in that perspective, and that's also why I think people are backing up on this proposal from the government, because as both of my colleagues here on the panel here says that freedom of speech that's holy in Denmark. I mean, it's and yes, so the political debate says that this could be an infringement of that, but I think that people are having a more pragmatic attitude towards this. I mean, they find it is an immature provocation, and people are fine with if we can somehow stop that.
Yeah, Per, let me just also ask you. You just mentioned that these are small groups of people. You said that are desecrating the Quran there in Denmark, and officials have said that as well. What kind of numbers are we talking about when we say these are small groups? Like how small?
2 or 3 people or something. I mean, we had Rasmus Paludan who did that, and now we have a small far-right nationalist party who are. I mean, some would say they are seeking their 15 minutes of fame on this. So it is a very, very small, marginalized group here. So it's by no means an expression of sort of widespread attitudes in Denmark. I mean, people can disagree on immigration and on Islam and all that, but this is sort of not a deeply rooted attitude and feeling about the Quran and Islam. Not at all.
Khaled, this move by the Danish government to criminalize Quran burning and the burning of other holy books, I mean, is this something that would be enough to appease anger in the Muslim world?
I don't know if it would be entirely enough to, sort of like, address or rectify the structural racism and Islamophobia in Denmark and across Western Europe. But I think it is a really strong symbolic stance if the bill passes to say that, hey, these kind of deviant Quran burnings will not be sanctioned by law. And I think one thing that's really important to know is when we think about freedom of expression being a cornerstone of any democracy, so is free exercise of religion, right? Those two kind of go hand in hand, freedom of conscience. And it's important to know how deviant acts of freedom of expression really eat in and erode the ability of specifically vulnerable religious groups to freely express their religion. And we see in Denmark how that's been, undermined and eroded for Muslims in that country for a long time. So for Muslim majority countries who see a law like this, and again, it's unprecedented in Western Europe because laws like this haven't been enacted in countries like the UK or in France, for instance. It is, I think, a really strong first step towards conveying to Muslim communities, but also Muslim majority countries, that Denmark is really making an attempt to address the structural racism within the country.
Khaled, let me also just follow up with you and ask you, when it comes to Denmark's foreign policy, especially in relation to Muslim majority countries, what kind of a bind have these Quran burnings put Denmark in?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question because it sort of like, isolates what is the genuine motive of Denmark introducing a bill of this kind. And it seems to me from some of the reading and research that I've done in the last 24 hours that, foreign policy is the central driver. The Deputy Minister of Denmark has even stated explicitly that the Quran burnings have put Denmark in a really difficult situation in foreign policy conversations with Muslim majority countries, specifically, very influential, very economically powerful Muslim majority countries like the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. So in many respects, this has really compromised Denmark's ability to, position itself in very advantaged ways on the foreign policy front. And it's real recognition on the part of the government, specifically this minister who's in office right now, to say that if we don't address what's going on with these Quran burnings and Islamophobia domestically, then this might really, harm our economic and political interests on the foreign policy context.
Farid, I see you reacting to a lot of what Khaled was just saying there. It looks like you want to jump in, so please go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think, this whole foreign policy front is a very important aspect because I think on the one hand, Denmark and the political leaders in Denmark are, I'm sure, very much aware still and still remember the days in 2005 when there was this whole cartoon crisis when this newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, published several cartoons of the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, where this sparked enormous demonstrations and Muslim clerics and countries jumped on this trail. So I think, they really definitely considering the economic aspects of this controversy. And there is one thing that really worries me a little bit because obviously, the whole Quran burning thing has become a very global discussion and it's very easy to grasp, right? It does not need a lot of analysis. But really what I'm worried about is at the very same time, Denmark has also been at the forefront of some of the countries in Europe that are implementing institutionalized Islamophobia. And I'm speaking specifically reminding listeners of the so-called ghetto laws that have been changed in terms of the naming. There is a lot of racial profiling problems Danish Muslims are experiencing. There is even a category that has been implemented in citizenship law, which is called menabt, which basically distinguishes the already very racist category of non-Westerns from Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, and Turkey. And there are so many other structural problems. And what I really worry is that we are not looking at these issues that are really harming the Muslim community in Denmark, but rather really sticking only to this very symbolic level of Quran burning, which is, and I fully understand people's feelings are hurt, etc. But this is not, I think, the real main problem that Muslims are facing in countries like Denmark.
Per, I want to ask you about something that was mentioned there by Farid. He talked about the cartoon crisis of 2006. That's when the Danish newspaper published cartoons depicting the Prophet Mohammed that were considered to be blasphemous. And I want to ask you, because you wrote a book about that crisis, I want to ask you, how is that impacting all of this right now? How much is all of that in the minds of lawmakers now who are proposing to change the laws when it comes to banning the burning of holy books?
Well, it obviously that plays a role, and I think they have learned something from that crisis back in 2006. At that time, we stood very firm on the freedom of speech, and the government refused to meet with some of the representatives from the Muslim communities and others. And now this is seen as we are putting a hand forward here, and so we certainly learned from that, and that's what we see now, and I mean the cartoon crisis. This is something I would say it's different this time around. That in 2006 it was a huge topic. It was a very hot topic. It was everywhere you went. I mean, dinner parties at schools and everywhere. Everybody talked about it. We were actually quite shocked on the reactions around the world on that. This time, what we are seeing now is that people do have a more pragmatic attitude to it. It's not a big issue here as such among ordinary people. So it's obviously, the government takes it very seriously, and that's also why we see this proposal. But sort of in the majority or among ordinary people, it is not a big issue in the same way it was in 2006. But again, the polls show support. Again, it's important to know. I know one of the colleagues here talk about structural racism and stuff like that, but it's not in that context. This is seen in Denmark. I mean, people know that it's a few far-right nationalist radical people doing something basically just a provocation and to get some airtime. And that's how most people see this.
Farid, I saw you just now reacting once again to a lot of what Per was saying, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to jump in again.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I fully agree with Pierre. I mean, I think the act of the Quran burning has always been and still is very much, in the history of the last 20 years of Islamophobia around the globe, has been an act of the very far right and sometimes also the leftists, just to be fair. It came originally actually from gay activists in New York, where this was invented in the new Islamophobia industry, and I think really, I mean, one of the things that we also always have to keep in mind, I am originally from Austria, right? And one of the things that we remind ourselves of when we hear Quran, like book burning in general, is that this very famous saying from a poem of Heinrich Heine, where he said, "Those who burn books will end up burn people." And it is something that we speak about in the context of the Nazi regime, when the Jews, before the Jews went to the concentration camps. So this is something in modern European history. I think the whole book burning has a very, very, very bad connotation. And I believe the overall debate that we should have here really is to what extent is the support, even if it's marginal, of these sorts of acts is representing a sentiment that is out there in a lot of countries where Muslims have been vilified for decades, through the war on terror and the vilification of Islam as a religion in itself. This has led to something, and it always expands the notion of what is permissible. And I think for the Danish society, as any other society too, having these debates about where is the border, should we stop allowing something to happen is an absolute necessary discussion that has to take place. But again, at the backdrop of a larger problem in which we are finding ourselves.
Khaled, let me ask you about another aspect to all of this. If this move by Danish politicians to criminalize the burning of holy books, if this actually were to pass in Parliament and to become law, is there a concern that this might give far-right groups more ammunition when it comes to spreading their message? I mean, is there a worry that it could somehow play into their hands?
Yeah, in some respects. But, before I answer that question specifically, I want to sort of address some of the points my colleagues made. I think it's dangerous to sort of like minimize these Quran burnings as being the, acts or, public performances of a small fringe few on the far right. Especially when you look at the transnational effect of these Quran burnings. Look, Rasmus Paludan went into Sweden, did these Quran burnings in concentrated Muslim communities in Stockholm, places like Rinkeby, and has been doing so for years. And as a consequence of, his, vile activism, it's given real fuel to the rise of the Sweden Democrats in that country, the rise of Islamophobia. So beyond these Quran burnings just being these performances of a far few, they really drive and fuel real far-right movements that can co-opt government, not only in Denmark, but in places like Sweden. So it's important to frame that these Quran burnings have had transnational and regional impact, in Scandinavia specifically. So definitely so. I think responding to your question, elements like Paludan and the Sweden Democrats, in Sweden, beyond Denmark, far-right actors can say, look, bills like this demonstrate how these Muslims are coming into our countries and taking over and impacting our laws and compromising our freedom of expression. They can offer real symbolic, and emblematic examples of how Muslims are changing Danish and Swedish society, which can then have the effect of energizing and then mobilizing these far-right groups. So the bill, hopefully it does pass, can have, in some respects, a negative effect to add more fodder for these far-right groups to really signal and say, hey, these Muslims are coming in and changing our laws, changing our policies. We got to stand up and do something.
Khaled, let me ask you this. You talked about, you said that these Quran burnings can have a transnational impact, that they can have regional impacts beyond the borders of Denmark. I want to ask you, if this were to become law, this movement to ban the burning of holy books in Denmark, if it does pass Parliament, if it becomes law, would we see other European governments take similar steps going forward?
I think potentially so, and I think Fareed can respond to this question specifically, writing on European Islamophobia. I think there are some aberrations. Countries like France, for instance, where I don't think a law of this kind would be enacted. But perhaps across Scandinavia, places like Sweden, if the political sort of dynamics change, I think there is a less entrenched form of Islamophobia in Scandinavian countries, which historically, specifically Sweden, right, which have been more inclusionary when it comes to immigrants and religious minorities like Muslims. But it's important to note that Western Europe is by no means a monolith, and in some countries, a law like this, in my opinion, would be unimaginable in the short term.
So, Fareed, let me ask you then, do you think, from your vantage point, that if this were to become law in Denmark, are we going to see more European governments take similar steps and try to pass similar laws?
I fully agree with what has just been said. I think there is no reason to believe that. I mean, there are a couple of countries that, let's say, are more inclined towards a dominant Christian denomination, where you already have those sorts of legislations. Take, for instance, Austria or Germany, who do have like blasphemy laws. And then there are the large bulk of European countries is very far away from that. So I don't believe that Denmark would spark such a trend all over Europe. And I think one of the important aspects here also is the geopolitical dimension of the whole debate. I mean, that's especially the case for Sweden and its intention to become a member of NATO, which is still, they are still bargaining. So President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has agreed, still the national parliament has to approve that decision. So and he clearly said, like, this will only happen probably when if there is something done in regards to the PKK, but also to the Quran burnings. So I think this geopolitical dimension is one important aspect, especially for the Scandinavian countries, in terms of the current crisis going on within Europe in regards to Russia's attack on Ukraine.
Per, we don't have too much time left, but let me ask you first, do you believe that the move to enact this legislation in Denmark, does this have the potential to deepen political divisions in the country?
No, I don't think so. And I have to repeat myself again. I mean, it is the work of a few people who are more or less marginalized. And yes, Rasmus Paludan also went to Sweden, but again, it is. I don't think it's a sort of a piece of a bigger trend or something like. I mean, it is the work of a few people doing this. And no, I don't. I mean, we have always been discussing this, and we have had this discussion. I mean, Denmark and now Sweden has. In Denmark, we have had this debate about immigration for many years. I think Denmark is 20 years ahead of Sweden. Now it's coming to Sweden, and yes, Sweden has been more inclusive for many years, and now they have some social, political issues and problems that it's completely natural what we see on the political scene with the rise of the Swedish Democrats party there. So it's
Per, I'm sorry to interrupt. We just have about a minute and a half left. One last quick question for you. I just want to get back to the economic angle in all of this, and I want to ask you, what kind of economic pressure is this putting on Denmark, especially when it comes to business relationships with rich Arab countries?
Obviously, that's a part of it, but it's not the big thing. And we saw that under the cartoon crisis back in 2006. Yes, some companies are selling, but that's not the major issue. Obviously, we want to. We don't want to harm our company, our businesses. So that's a part of it as well. But it's also a matter of our reputation globally, protecting also against terrorist attacks and stuff like that. So it's. I mean, it's not only the money here. That's for sure.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Khaled Beydoun, Per Bech Thomsen, and Farid Hafiz. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here. Bye for now.